have a lack of global cooperation. We have a worsening climate crisis, of which Pakistan has been a notable victim in the tragic and massive and unprecedented flooding that Pakistan experienced. And we're just having a very difficult time. I think the biggest problem in the world by far is the failure of our political systems to keep a focus on the needs of people and to engage civilly and respectfully and peacefully with other countries. And for me, as a United States citizen, I bemoan the militarization of U.S. politics and its very aggressive approach, unfortunately, to the rest of the world. The mindset of the U.S. is really not of the U.S. The mindset of the U.S. government is a little crazy, which is that it just is desperately intent to be number one, whatever that means, because it makes no sense to me, even this kind of ranking. But the U.S. is more jealous of other countries like China than it is paying attention to well-being. And we're getting in a lot of conflicts as a result of that geopolitics. For Pakistan, I don't have to belabor the point that the great, completely unsolved and ongoing absence of normal relations with India, basically just hostile relations, is a fundamental risk and barrier to well-being and to economic development. I have one basic principle of economic development, and that is be friends with your neighbors. It's easier said than done, but countries trade with their neighbors. Countries share ecosystems with their neighbors. Pakistan and India share the Punjab and the Indus River Valley and the upper Himalayas and so much more. And if there could be peace, that by itself, even without any changes of other policies, would be an incredible boon. I know I'm dreaming, and I don't mean to be naive at the outset, but it is a big, big challenge in this world that we just cannot find a way to get along peacefully. And because of that, we suffer so much loss of when we should be solving problems. Now, let me turn to Pakistan in particular as a very large, extremely important emerging economy facing all sorts of difficulties. And let me tell you how, as a trained macroeconomist, I do kind of the medical exam to look at Pakistan's charts and to say, what are my basic diagnostics? So I happen to have given a talk to the Pakistan Economists Society just yesterday. And so I did a look at the charts. I went on to the IMF website and I downloaded the most recent data from the World Economic Outlook. And it's like taking the pulse of an economy. And you see things right away that are absolutely evident of the fundamental problems. The fundamental problem for Pakistan is that it's stuck in development right now. Economic growth is low, highly volatile. This year will be negative, prone to crisis, feeling lots of shocks like the floods, which were devastating, of course, and no fault of Pakistan, but devastating. And no clear prospect of how to change this scenario. So if you take the pulse of a patient, you
get a lot of quick information. And if I take the pulse of Pakistan's macroeconomy, the first variable that I looked at in the data is the investment rate, which is the total domestic investment in infrastructure and in business in Pakistan, measured as a share of national income. And last year, the investment rate was 14%. 14% investment rate means barely enough to cover depreciation. And of course, in fact, with the floods, not even enough to stay level. Pakistan has had a net decline of its fixed capital assets in the last few years because the investment rate is so low. You compare that with China, where growth has been high and robust for 40 years, basically 45 years since 1978. What's the investment rate in China? Typically between 40 and 50% of the gross domestic product. So roughly 3 times Pakistan's investment rate. So this is the first
simple diagnostic. Pakistan is not investing in its future, and therefore could not expect under current
policy conditions to achieve sustained economic development. So I looked at the second indicator that I regard as the most important for a society. Investment is one measure of how to look forward. School attainment is a second measure of how to look forward, because basically schooling is investment. We say investment in human capital. It's probably the single most important investment that a society makes, is enabling its boys and girls to grow up with education and labor market skills.
And when you look at the investment in human capital in Pakistan, it's equally low.
In fact, nearly disastrous. The single best measure of schooling is the so-called school life expectancy, which is the statistical average number of years that a child is likely to complete based on the net enrollment rate for each age group. So it's like a life expectancy. If a child enters school at age 5 or at age 6, how many years is that child likely to be in school? The answer for Pakistan, according to the World Bank data, is about 8 years of schooling. And of course, there's a variation around that, but 8 years is one of the lowest rates of schooling in the entire world. And one might think that there's a huge gender gap. That's what I would have expected. It's not right. Schooling is low for boys and for girls. Roughly 9 years for boys and about 8 years for girls, and an average of 8 point something. Pakistan cannot develop if children on average are getting 8 years of schooling, because to be able to develop and use modern industrial techniques, at a minimum, an individual needs a upper high school completion, but really something beyond that, some kind of tertiary education, whether vocational skills or a bachelor's degree or the equivalent. And Pakistan is very far from this. So this is the second major indicator that I looked at, and I said, that's not good. The third major indicator that I looked at yesterday was government revenue as a share of the gross domestic product. Why is that so important? Well, government revenue finances 2 absolutely crucial forward-looking areas. One is the public investment, the roads, the bridges, the uh, environmental resilience. And the second is the human investment, the schooling, the research and development agenda, the healthcare system, and so forth. And that has to be paid for out of government revenues in some way, either today or in the future if those outlays are financed by borrowing today. You still need the revenues in the future. So I looked at the share of government revenue in the gross domestic product. It's 12% of GDP, one of the lowest in the world. So the government does not mobilize resources. The government spends 19% of GDP, runs a budget deficit of 7% of GDP, but even the 19% of the gross domestic product is not enough to cover the most basic services. My guess is that if you did the calculation, which I didn't do yet, for Pakistan of what it would really cost to provide a decent education for all the children and to ensure that a significant cohort, maybe 30%, go on to tertiary education, my guess is that the outlays would have to be at least 10% of the gross domestic product. And if the total revenues are 12% of the gross domestic product, well, that means more than 83% of the budget would be devoted to education alone, which is obviously an impossibility. So there clearly is a massive shortfall of the public sector in Pakistan. And the public sector is essential for human capital because there is no way that the private sector is going to educate Pakistan's young people. It's essential for healthcare because, again, there's no way that a health system could ever be put together by the private sector other than for a small elite. It's essential for public infrastructure, for roads, for transport, for communications, for climate resilience, for flood protection, for biodiversity conservation, and so on. So the revenue base is just absolutely too low. And nonetheless, because even the spending that's done, which is too small, is large relative to the revenues, there's a 7% of GDP budget deficit. This is in 2022. And that is the underlying reason for Pakistan's high inflation rate, which is around 20 to 30% annual rate, according to the official statistics. So none of that is robust. This is a patient in really need for a significant lifestyle change and a significant change of the fiscal framework, of the investment framework, and with a suitable strategy for economic recovery. Now, none of that is happening right now, I'm also sorry to say, because the floods were a huge hit, probably a loss of at least 10% of GDP, probably significantly more than that, an estimated loss of about $30 to $50 billion outright in costs. Of course, the world helped a little bit, but not very much. So the bill was left entirely with Pakistan, or almost entirely with Pakistan. Add that to the pandemic, which was another disaster. By the way, in my understanding and best guess, a disaster that was human caused, because I think that it was misguided US-backed science that created that virus, just as a footnote, rather than this being a natural occurrence. I think the United States government made a disaster, which it will never admit and does everything to hide, but I think it was probably a US constructed virus from the hundreds of hours of research that I've devoted to that and innumerable discussions with scientists. So this is another huge hit. And then, of course, the crisis came to Pakistan's finance, and Pakistan went to the IMF. And the answer of the IMF is typical, which is cut spending. Spending which is already completely inadequate. And the IMF's idea is austerity. And why? Well, because the IMF doesn't care about Pakistan's development. The IMF cares about Pakistan not creating a financial crisis. So the answer of the IMF is austerity, cut spending. What are you going to cut? It's already completely inadequate. And be quiet and don't make a crisis. And this is standard IMF fare. And of course, they're right in one sense that a financial crisis is terrible. Inflation of 20 to 30% is bad, very destabilizing, and can absolutely get out of hand. So I don't disagree with the IMF on that. But it's not an answer to Pakistan's deeper problems to say that austerity is needed. So that's the reading the medical charts. Now, what to do? First, I regret to tell you, no magic answers, no simple answers. The most basic thing to do first is the diagnostics, and second, the planning. What Pakistan needs is a plan to get out of this mess. And the basic core of the plan needs to be investment-led growth. Because that's redundant. There is no economic growth without investment. And so what is needed is a rise of the investment rate. And remember, the magic of China's success has been a very high level of investment carried for more than 40 years. They did a great job. And they really sustained the right kind of economic policy for more than 40 years. And it was completely investment-led. So no magic, just building the roads, building the fast rail, building the power grids, building the digital grids, educating the kids, putting them through school, building the healthcare system. This is really at the core of it. Of course, with plans to repay the financing for this, whether it was domestic or foreign borrowing, to repay it through rapid economic growth, fueled by business development, especially fueled by export earnings. So the China model is the right model for Pakistan or for any emerging economy. It's a high investment model. It's a high economic growth model, roughly 7 to 10% per year economic growth. In many years, 10% per year, meaning that the period to double
The economy is a mere 7 years, and they did that for 5 doublings, so that there was a 2 to the 5th or 32 times increase of China's economy. And that is the framework that a plan for Pakistan should have. Now, the essential question for Pakistan would become quickly how to
mobilize the resources for that kind of investment. The investment rate would rise from what I said, 14% of GDP to absolutely more than 30% of GDP, somewhere between 30 and 40% of GDP. And that would lift Pakistan's growth from basically negative right now, and on average, maybe 4%, up to 7 to 10% per year, depending on the quality of the investments and peace and other things that Pakistan urgently needs. So the question then becomes where to make the investments and how to finance the investments. The where to make the investments is a pretty identifiable list of investments. And just to mention them quickly, education, number one, get the kids in school, ensure quality of schooling. Number two, build a basic healthcare system that can meet the core healthcare needs of the whole population. Number three, energy and industrial development, but especially now decarbonized energy, because this is the only kind of energy system that's going to be acceptable in the 21st century building forward. Fourth is sustainable land use and agricultural productivity. The fifth is urban infrastructure, because of the huge and rapidly growing urban populations. And the sixth is digital transformation to provide essentially universal digital access, because so many core services, education, healthcare, payment systems, public services, public administration will be online in the future. And so having a 5G network in order to use these digital services is critical. So those are the six main areas for investment. And then the plan should include targets for scaling up these core investments and an identified financing strategy. Now, what kind of strategy is this? There are basically three components to the strategy. One is that the government will absolutely need to raise revenues as a share of GDP over time under any imaginable scenario. You cannot have development collecting less than 20% of GDP in government revenues, but I would say basically 25 to 30% of GDP in government revenues. So I would at least aim to double the ratio of government revenues to GDP as is currently the case. That would provide increasing resources for public investments and for education and healthcare outlays in the future. The second is to take steps to raise the private saving rates. One of China's great virtues and successes was a very high rate of household saving, even of poor households, because there was a reliable system to invest household assets and to expect that they would have a payoff for older age or for raising children or for moving to urban areas. So the high saving rate of the private sector is a second component. And a third component is actually taking on more debt, external finance, but crucially, long-term external debt, not short-term external debt. This is the huge mistake of development finance for a country to borrow on the bond market a 7-year bond to invest in infrastructure that requires a 30-year or 40-year payout, or to invest 7 years, borrow at 7 years to invest in social services like schooling, but the returns to schooling, which are incredibly high economically, take 30 years to realize, because you take a 5-year-old today and you don't get the returns to the schooling until that child is 35 or 40 years old. So you can't borrow for 7 years and expect that you're going to be able to pay back in 7 years. So this strategy of finance is a strategy of long-term financing that is crucial. And I'll just end here because I know I'm running long to say that it is possible to mobilize long-term financing, but it requires creativity and directed policy. A partnership with China is one important step because China's Belt and Road Initiative should lend to Pakistan or finance Pakistan's infrastructure on a 30-year lending basis. And that, to my mind, should be the terms that Pakistan requests from Chinese partners. Similarly, Pakistan has access to the Asian Development Bank or the Islamic Development Bank or other official lenders that also should have the mandate to make long-term loans to Pakistan. Now, it turns out, surprisingly, because it's usually said that Pakistan has a debt crisis, that the level of indebtedness of Pakistan to foreign creditors is only 35% of GDP, according to the IMF data. That's not very much. Pakistan's debt crisis is that the payments are coming due and no one wants to lend new money to Pakistan. That's what we call a liquidity problem or a rollover problem, not a solvency or debt level problem. So what Pakistan needs is a debt management strategy that is based on long-term borrowing and proper management of flows so that Pakistan can actually take on much more debt, but then use that for the investments that are going to generate 7 to 10% per year economic growth. And that's the basic framework that I think is important. Now, let me just add, since we're 9 days away from COP28 in Abu Dhabi and in Dubai and climate financing, Pakistan is the exemplar of why we need official grants to countries like Pakistan to face the losses and damages from climate change. Pakistan should have received $30 or $50 billion of insurance payments and transfers to face the flooding, not what it got, which was a small amount and a debt crisis. So in Dubai, there will be a lot of bickering about climate finance. My country is the most egregious of all countries because the US has done the most to make the human climate change. It's been the biggest share of fossil fuel burning, and it's the stingiest country as well, because the first statement of a US policymaker is we accept no historical responsibility whatsoever. We reject that. And that's obnoxious, actually. So we need countries to pay into a global losses and damages fund based on their historical responsibility. And this is an area where Pakistan would benefit and where Pakistan's very important global voice is so much needed. And the opportunity will come in short order in the next couple of weeks in Dubai. So let me conclude there. Very quick, a bit superficial, just to say that I would love to work together with you on this. Pakistan needs a strategy, a long-term high investment plan. It's achievable. You've got a good neighbor with China to help do that, actually, because they did it and they can help on this. And I would be delighted to help in any way as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. As you can probably imagine, people have listened to you in pin drop silence. Let me turn this over to Faria and see how we want to conduct this session. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, for a very insightful keynote. concerning sustainable development in Pakistan in chaotic times and also suggesting the diagnostics. Now we are going to open up the floor for an interactive session of the audience with Dr. Sachs. In this regard, may I please request if you can introduce yourself first and then put forth the question directly to Dr. Sachs. So please.
Thank you, Professor. I'm Vishnu Preti from Nepal. It was really insightful perspective. But
We
one
can't hear you.
dimension you didn't bring was Indian role. So do you see any of the positive contribution from India to the economic or political development of the Pakistan and the region as a whole? Because there are also other countries facing somehow difficulties with India. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And let me apologize that I note that I have a live interview waiting for me, so I'm only going to be able to take this one question. Somehow my schedule got terribly jammed. But let me say one word about the South Asian region. It is, if you include Bhutan, Nepal, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, of course, it is a crucial, ecologically interconnected, culturally, historically, geographically interconnected region that is, of course, deeply divided politically. And this is a huge problem. And I don't have to belabor that. You know this 1,000 times more than I do. But a region like South Asia should be an integral region with cross-border cooperation, cross-border infrastructure, like a power system that connects the Himalayas, the high Himalayan countries, Bhutan and Nepal, with the rest of South Asia, that treats the watersheds as a regional issue, the Indus River Valley, the Himalayan river systems, and so forth, as an integrated system that treats the difficulties of deforestation in the high Himalayas, which is a very serious problem, as a regional strategy, and which negotiates vis-a-vis the rest of the world as a group. Of course, this isn't happening at all because of the deep political divisions within the region. And there's there's basically no trade between India and Pakistan. You can't even take a bus, as far as I understand, from one to the other. And the costs of this to both sides is absolutely enormous. So again, I don't want to be naive, and I don't want to say to a room that understands these issues 1,000 times more than I do how to resolve this. But what I can say as an economist is that the benefits of resolving these differences would be profound, hugely beneficial for everybody. India, by the way, is achieving some real breakthroughs economically. Some of its big industries, like Reliance, for example, that I know quite well, really are doing an excellent job of providing industrial development and spreading infrastructure. India has done a very good job of creating the digital backbone and getting more than 1 billion people online, and so forth. This could and should be a benefit for the whole region. It should be a benefit for everybody, because this kind of rapid growth that India is experiencing should positively spill over for the region. The barriers are fundamentally political. They're not economic or technological barriers. So if something can be done to break those bottlenecks, believe me, the payoffs in economic development would be enormous, And if there's any way to help move that forward, count me in to help move it forward.
Thank you very much,
thank
Dr.
you.
Sachs. Yes, ma'am, please.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say thank you very much for your exceptional.
Dr. Sachs,
talk.
maybe request one more question from one of the lady in the participant.
I just can't because I'm 8 minutes late for a live radio
Sure.
show. So
We understand.
I'm going to have to excuse myself,
Sure.
I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. We're extremely grateful for your thoughts that you shared in this session and for your time. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. We'll see all of you soon and in face-to-face, I hope, which would be wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we couldn't. So this brings us to the end of today's event, and sure. Sure.
Yes.
Sure, definitely.
And no, thank you very much for the space. I am Esther Perez, the IMF resident representative in Pakistan, and I just wanted to start out sharing with the audience an excellent collaboration we had with Professor Sachs at the IMF back in 2019 on the SDGs agenda. A few of us were collaborating and having him in an advisory capacity. And as I said, it was a very successful collaboration. I just wanted to maybe go back and make a couple of points. First of all, I think we at the fund think, as Professor Sachs, that raising growth prospects necessitates lifting the investment rate. But we also think that it is critically important to discuss also what type of investments and reconciling the need to ease these balance of payments constraints with fostering investment, and what kind of investment. And are we talking about investment in non-tradables that perhaps is going to exacerbate the BOP constraints, or are we talking about facilitating investment that can integrate Pakistan into the global value chains and therefore allow Pakistan to generate reserves which are very much needed, and what is the role of trade policy in all that? I see that the former Minister for Overseas with us. The second part of my intervention was by allusion, and thanks for the opportunity to explain our role in supporting the government in stabilizing the economy in the near term, and also in creating the conditions for higher and more inclusive growth going forward. It is obviously the case that the social and development needs in Pakistan are very substantial. And I just wanted to share with everyone and reassure everyone that in the context of our program, there are indicative targets and quantitative criteria to protect social programs, and it is a fact that every year we work with the government to continue expanding the BISP allocation, to expand the coverage, and also to secure that the real pay of the ST payment is kept amidst a very highly inflationary environment. And secondly, we also have indicative targets for education and healthcare, in this case with the provinces, because the responsibility for spending in those areas lies with them. And we make sure through our field engagements that we stay attuned to the realities in the ground, as shared with us by development partners and the United Nations. Of course, we also recognize, and the authorities can obviously see, that there is a lot more to be done, and that education and healthcare needs to increase substantially to really invest in human capital in Pakistan. And that necessitates, and we are also working with the authorities in this space, necessitates much higher revenues to GDP. And here the priority over the coming months will be to broaden the tax base, to actually incorporate to the tax base largely under tax sectors as a matter of tax efficiency and also equity. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. If others would like to share thoughts or contribute to the ongoing discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just wanted to carry on from what was said by the IMF representative. My name is Amir Durrani, and 20 years in the World Bank until 2014. We've heard Jeffrey Sachs many a times. Last I heard him in Astana, 2014 at ADB annual meetings. Very honestly, I have huge respect for the gentleman, but I think let's be very clear on what was just said, that when you want to incentivize inward investment and you want to say that our investment rates are low, I think that the reality on the ground is that just getting investment rates high without the quality of investment in the sectors in which it is going is not going to get Pakistan anywhere. And I think two things which we must, and I would like to hear again from some of the august people sitting here in the audience, what Sachs is missing is the whole fragility element of Pakistan. Because Pakistan is missing the core engine now, even if, and you know, not only have you been in commerce, you have been our finance minister as well. So I would like to question what happens if we have inward investment like Vietnam and suddenly we are linked to the global value chains and they are dumb enough to actually do that. So what do we produce? Where is the core productive industrial engine of Pakistan? Is that one of those things that Jeffrey is talking about that is going to take another 30 years because we have kind of devoided ourselves of that core so much, it's so eroded from the 70s and the 80s that not much is left. So where do we invest? And the second part, which I think he and everybody, all of us should think about, is one of the things that does not show up on the indicators is local investment, which like Stephen Durkon, he does mention that local investment chasing local productivity is really the real engine of growth in Pakistan, because really those are investments in which foreign exchange risk hedging is not required. So yes, the structure of finance and how we look at it in Pakistan has to be treated differently than from this, what is called a debt problem. So, you know, I think that we need to make that difference. So, thank you.
Thank you. Would someone like to respond to the point raised by Durrani Saab, the quality of investment that matters and also the fragility of the economy, the missed aspect in the conversation?
First of all, must commend Jeffrey for making such almost correct assessment of the situation just on the basis of one or two tables that he's seen out of the World Economic Outlook. The World Economic Outlook tables are the most macroeconomic tables that you can find on a country. Let me say that the devil is in the detail. There's no doubt that the revenue collection is very little, but he does not know that the entire tax revenue of Pakistan this year will be spent on making interest payments on domestic debt. With an interest rate policy which is going to kill any investment in Pakistan. I mean, that is a great dilemma for Pakistan. And we have been following a policy of high interest rates to curb inflation, which is not coming down, which is just not responding to that. So there, you see, macroeconomics requires an integrated approach, monetary, fiscal, and external sector all tied together. And I think this point about the quality of investment is very, very important. We have been investing a lot on infrastructure, which, by the way, earns its income, especially when it comes to the FDI, it earns its income in rupees. And the profits and interest payments are taken out in dollars. It actually causes a drain on the balance of payments.
So, the quality or the nature of the investment is very important in all this. But look at it that when we talk of domestic investment, which Amir has very rightly pointed out, we have high import duties on machinery. We are all driven by the revenue factor so much that we forget that what are we taxing. We're not looking at the other, we only look at the revenue impact of a tax. We do not look at its impact on investment, on resource allocation, or on income distribution. So we really need to get into the detail of it all. And that is what is very important. I think the broad direction that Jeffrey's pointed out, I agree with it, but I think it requires a lot more debate on the details. Thank you.
Yes. We can take a couple of comments. We do have time.
If I may request Esther Perez, the country director of IMF, who is sitting here, please join me on stage. We'll take up only 2 or 3 more interventions. I think perhaps Esther can try to demystify some of the problems. And as Professor Jeffrey Sachs alluded to some of the IMF prescription, I think it is wise to listen from her as well, why IMF is saying what IMF has been saying, what's the rationality behind it, from monetary policy to other. But I would like it to keep an academic discussion, please. And we will be just taking 2 or 3 interventions. We intend to conclude in next 5-7 minutes.
Abid, can I make a comment and then I will beg your leave if I can?
Thank you very much, Esther, for making. I know it was so spontaneous, but I'm extremely thankful to you to accept my suggestion of being here and take some questions. So we'll take 3 questions and then I'll request Esther to respond to them.
Start with on a light note. I was in my office over the past few months, and we were getting from SDPI the invitation to participate and possibly organize some of these sessions. And we were scratching our heads and really unable to come back to you because we were very much focused in an office of 2 economists, 1 office manager and myself, to really focus our efforts on the program engagement that we have with Pakistan. But, things happen for a reason. So I very much appreciate the spontaneity, and this is a closed door discussion. So I appreciate I'm sharing in confidence. Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, Tariq.
Okay.
Without being too diplomatic about it, nothing that Jeff said was either new or surprising. And that's very important to know. It's important for 2 reasons. One is that there is no shortcut. There's no magical journey. There's no get-rich-quick scheme which is going to get out of this thing. All that he was saying is, look, these are well-known truths in economics. You people haven't been following them. And if you don't follow them, this is what you get. And, it's a long-term struggle. You need to sort of get the thing right. And that's so it's very important. I think there is a tendency here to think in terms of quick get-rich-quick schemes. And he was basically saying that that's not this thing. I think he was much more sympathetic towards the IMF program in this talk than I have seen him in other contexts. And the reason is obvious, that there is an argument for and an argument against. The argument for is very clear. There is a problem and that does need to be fixed. But the argument against comes from political economy. and which is that the nature of the crisis is not only economic, it's a combination of political and economic. And it is, driven by the gradual deterioration in governance, because of which a lot of the things that people say cannot be done. So our tax rate has been very resistant to any kind of an increase. The public sector investment, by and large, is extremely inefficient. There is a lot of corruption in the public sector investment program, and therefore it doesn't really get to this thing. The governmental efforts in most of the sectors that we are talking about are extremely weak and so forth. So the problem that we see, and Dr. Perez, I'm addressing you, the problem that we see is that Pakistan's challenge is what we would call the rebuilding of the developmental state. And like Jeff, I don't feel that austerity is the way to do it. I do feel that some kind of a conditionality that pushes us in that direction, as opposed to wasting the resources that we have currently, is needed. So austerity itself is not something that we find to be a very bad solution. Having said that, the kind of conditionality which actually imposes limits on the propensity of the government for folly and so forth are important, and to that extent we are very supportive of the intervention that has been produced. So it's a kind of a nuanced support for what you're doing, but we do think that you also need to take a much more actively political economy view of the situation. Thank you.
Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta, sir, thank you very much for inviting Jeffrey Sachs for us, and it was great listening to him. It was courtesy Dr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutta we could reach to Jeffrey Sachs and have him here virtually. Dr. Sahab, I see your hand raised.
So so first of all, thank you, Abid, for the opportunity. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you in person, but I hope to be there the day after tomorrow. So I think I may not be an economist, but I know certainly enough about development and global development to kind of underscore a few things which I've not only discussed with Jeff, but I think he was very polite today. He didn't lay it on the line as I had hoped that he would. And that is to say that with an elitist economy that we have, where there has been absolutely no way of introducing basic reform in terms of bringing people into the tax net who ought to be in the tax net, in reducing the kind of expenditures that we have at this stage, which could be obviated to some extent by promotion of peace in the neighborhood, whether or not we like it or not. And third, is ensuring that we have a bare minimum of social sector investments in education, in health, that are essential in terms of promotion of human capital. There is a vicious cycle. If we don't invest enough in this, and I've just finished a conference here in Karachi, where we've been looking at principally some of the SDG 3 areas. Without investments in some of those basics, we will continue to have 5 Pakistans, 5 epidemiological differentiated parts of the country, where we may have quality of life in cities like Islamabad or Karachi, which are maybe same as some middle-income countries, but we have places in the country where the demographics and the health and development indicators are worse than Africa. And I see no way of us getting out of this morass with an economy that does not look after the poorest of the poor, where essentially you've got a whole generation that is not only out of school, but with enrollment rates going down, and with people principally getting education of the quality that they have no hope in hell of doing anything to climb up the development ladder. How are we going to get those funds without those fundamental things being addressed? So I think what Jeff was saying are things that everybody knows about, but nobody says it out in public, that without introduction of taxation for people who are currently out of the tax net, without putting real estate into the remit of people paying the due share, I mean, we are going to be struggling on the margins, and I don't think that's going to get us out of this morass.
Thank you very much for sharing these thoughts. I would also like to share my, again, spontaneous and official and personal thoughts about the interplay between private investment and social development. Because it has been mentioned, there are vicious circles, but as practitioners and advisors to countries, we would also like to think that there are some vicious circles and that there is some sort of causality or a starting point that we can take and move on from there and shift away from a vicious dynamics into a virtuous dynamics. And one thought that comes to mind is on education, on the investment, incentives for investment in education. Incentives for investment in education in Pakistan are likely very low now because employment opportunities are not particularly attractive. You know, if you think of, the average household in a remote rural area, rationally deciding whether, their children should go to school versus working, well, if they don't see around them employment opportunities that can make a difference and reward on education, maybe they decide to encourage their children to work, as soon as they can. No. Now, for these employment opportunities to arise, growing the private sector and creating opportunities for the private sector to invest and provide those jobs is critical. Yes, and the more incentives and the right incentives for private investment opportunities are there, the more jobs will be created and the more wealth will be also created for these newly hired people to contribute their fair share of taxes. And therefore, the more chances Pakistan will have to raise, revenues from their citizens and the more opportunities for investment in healthcare and education, so to continue to invest in human capital. That is one lever. The other lever is that, well, there are some people that unfortunately belong to those generations where they could not have access to these education opportunities. And what can we do for them, to adults in the 30s or 40s to train them, training opportunities, and what is the role of training programs in Pakistan to train those that for some reason unfortunately missed the education opportunities. Another lever is, well, there might be people that can't be educated at present, can't be trained at present, still, as a society, there is Pakistan is attached value to protecting the most vulnerable and expanding social protection and so on and so forth. So I think, I guess, coming back to my first point, I do see a lot of synergies, complementarities, and strong interplay between growing the private sector and creating the conditions for more investment in human capital in Pakistan. And that investment, again, should be one that can create employment opportunities and one which is not import intensive because, as we all know, Pakistan has an issue with this balance of payments constraints if investments are intense in goods that have to be imported.
Thanks, Esther. Can we take a few more comments from the room before we leave for dinner? Anyone who would like to raise any point, ask any question, especially the youngsters? I can see quite a few youngsters around as well. Engineer Jabbar, young at heart.
First of all, let me declare to have acquired the privilege of meeting with you in Karachi in Applied Economic Research Department, which I will repeat again. because I thought that after reading all these 22 and 23 programs, the one thing which we discussed over there was that IMF is not setting any KPIs, is not tabulating to thrust a force for implementation of reforms. The problem with Pakistan is nothing but a proper governance and a proper administration, not only in economic management, but in general management, in political economy of energy management, in political economy of gas management, to which you are also worried. But the solution by you is only that the sales cost and cost of recovery, or what you call cost of manufacturing, should be equal to the cost of sales. That's a good idea. I do accept. But then behind this, there is a story of big gaps. I again will repeat that what are the reasons what constrains you from considering us too over sovereign, not to ask us to really reform, so that at least in the political economy of power sector, it is the failure of governance and the style of governance wherein the professionalism is absent. You are not raising that voice. In the political economy of gas, where I also worked as director, and I think the minister, Mr. Naveed Kamar, is also here. So I can say that over there also, when I was there 10 years back, you see unaccounted for gas, what you call gas losses, were 7%. And today they are under and overestimated to be 20 to 25%. Merit economic order running the power plants and selling and getting rid of all the inefficient power plants is there. In K Electric alone, from where I come, I say that 3 plants must be closed immediately tomorrow, because they are not only inefficient, but their cost is beyond 53 rupees on otherwise minus of the taxes. So why you are not really so serious about where the cause has arisen and not where you want to heal it? That is good, your theory. I fully accept as a businessman that efficiency means the cost of manufacturing should be cost of sales and plus some money for me also in my pocket. That is your theory. I really respect it. But please consider why your board or IMF never considered to really thrust the pressure for reforms. And probably I think either if it is not in your policy that we are too over sovereign in the global village, that you restrain yourself from not applying that pressure. Thank you.
Is there any last question or comment before we जी नवीद माइक दीजिए नवीद कुमार साहब.
Don't want to get into much of a debate but I think one question remains unanswered, and that's a question that is not asked in intellectual and academic circles, but asked on the street. Is monetary policy enough to resolve the inflation issue in Pakistan? Because increasingly we see that while it's causing other problems, tight money is also not as yet being effective at controlling inflation. Please give you, obviously, both the official and unofficial view on that.
Again, given the impromptu engagement, it will be unofficial. No, I had a point on investment. Circling back to my previous intervention, I forgot about public investment, that there is an intent effort, and we are supporting the government in rationalizing public investment management. There was a technical assistance mission that came to Pakistan a few months ago, and they found some interesting things, such as it would take for Pakistan 14 years with the current allocation, PSDP allocation, 14 years to actually get to completion the pipeline of PSDP projects, which is telling us that there is a tendency to add more and more projects without finalizing the previous ones. And there is ongoing efforts to rationalize that pipeline and also to create tools to actually tag projects according to their climate change goals in the context of enhancing resilience of Pakistan to natural disasters. So that is one. On the energy sector, I think we fully see what you are saying. The main goals of the energy sector's initiatives, actions are to prevent further growing of the city and the combined city for the energy, gas, and electricity sectors exceeds 4% of GDP. So there is an issue here that could jeopardize the provision of energy to consumers, and an issue of liquidity constraints in the sector given significant arrears, and there is very no space, in the budget to accommodate any liquidity needs. So there is an urgency in keeping the sector viable, no? And the way to do that is to align tariffs with costs. Now, when users express concerns about tariffs being high, what is implicitly embedded in these concerns is that, well, the costs in Pakistan are high, and that goes to the points you were making, no? Because they are root-seated inefficiencies in the sector. So for the authorities to achieve the viability goal, critically, tariff needs to be aligned with cost, and for the authorities to meet the population's expectations for lower tariffs, or at least for tariffs not to continue increasing, well, there needs to be work on the cost side of the equation to bring costs down, no? And that means embracing structural reforms. That means there are currently efforts to bring in private participation in the discourse, to fight theft, to reduce the incentives for captive power, which actually impose higher tariffs on all of the users in the system, and also to consider whether the terms, the contract terms for the IPPs can be improved, and there is no question about the need to reduce those costs as long as there is no progress on this front. Well, again, there will continue to be tariff increases unless they give up on the goal of viability, which is not the stated goal of the authorities as of today. Then on monetary policy, we do see that the interest rate is the primary instrument to fight inflation. Of course, the authorities are cognizant of the implications for the cost of government debt, and the first line of action here is to keep, as everywhere else, to keep the borrowing needs very limited, no? And that's why the authorities for this fiscal year in particular, they are sticking to the 0.4% of GDP primary deficit target, keeping the borrowing needs very, very measured to prevent the interest rate bill from continuing growing. So I would leave it here. I think in Pakistan, it is important to understand well that, as Professor Sachs was saying, investment to GDP has been historically low. Exports to GDP has been historically low, and if you look at the record over the past 30 years, in some periods exports to GDP has actually been declining, no? And the question is why? Because for many years, I think there's been support to the exporting industries in the form of tax preferential treatments, in the form of low interest rates, in the form of subsidized energy, relatively inexpensive labor force compared with other countries. And despite that support, for some reason, Pakistan has not been able to lift exports as a share of GDP. Of course, as the economy goes through a stabilization period, you want to rationalize the price of energy, you want to rationalize the tax system, you also want to use monetary policy for the purpose of fighting inflation, and all these movements actually represent a challenge for the exporters. Now, a couple of hours before coming to this seminar, I was working with the economists in the office, and we wanted to answer this question: how much of the value added for the various economic sectors in Pakistan goes into exports versus domestic consumption investment? And the answer to this question is pretty discouraging. If you look at, we do this through or we collect these numbers from the input-output tables. And there is only a couple of industries, I won't mention which ones, there is only a couple of industries where that share, the export share, is significant. For the rest, the numbers really hover around between 5 to 10% export share relative to, the share of value added that goes into private consumption. Well, that is telling us that maybe for a long time, there's been a growth model that has been relying on imports and a cost of imports that was conveniently kept low to actually facilitate the provision of goods at not necessarily competitive prices domestically. And that has led probably to a situation where, significant profits were made. And the question is where these profits go, and why we haven't seen, investment growing, if the profits had gone into investment, or we've seen informality declining, employment prospects increasing, and more development. I think that's a question for Pakistan to really address, why despite all this support, it was not a growth model conducive to more exports, more investment opportunities, more employment opportunities, and more social prosperity.
Thank you, Esther, for I know it was out of blue. I requested you to be part of the panel, and I'm extremely grateful to you for accepting it. Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta would like you to convey our special gratitude and thanks to Professor Jeffrey Sachs for his time. Do tell him that how much we appreciated his intervention. We really wanted to do some more interactive question answers with you.
I think we probably should have requested him to spare some 10 minutes for discussion, like we've done in the past, but maybe crossed wires there. Not to it. Next time. Thank you.
Yes. If there are any media people in the room, kindly keep Esther's remark their in-camera personal remarks, not IMF, and please don't quote or contribute. As I said, that it was yes, but to summarize, ladies and gentlemen, this is about third or fourth session in this conference on Pakistan's economic issues with the different stakeholders and different set of experts, decision makers, and different set of multilateral organization with World Bank, with UNDP. We had Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. We have Esther here, and I can see commonality in it. There's certain areas on which I can see complete consensus, even in the diagnostic and the pulse that Dr. Jeffrey Sachs read, especially on mobilizing revenue, mobilizing resources, improving investment to GDP ratio, etc. Then, of course, in today's discussion, while we had the UNDP, the consensus was that it's not all about money. It's also about governance, and it's also about political economy of it. And there was this consensus in the room that while making general comments on economic way forward for Pakistan, we also need to keep in mind the heterogeneity among its confederating units. So perhaps some confederating units, they are now a more advanced stage of reforms. The other, they are still lagging behind. And then also this heterogeneity, sectoral heterogeneities. So in some sectors, we are working at an advanced pace. Others, we're still lagging. In one of the discussion, we were talking about health and education expenditures. And from provinces, it was told that they are already spending around 30 to 40% of their budget on health and education. And if they're asked to increase it, perhaps the absorption capacity within departments is not there. So one can, for example, in KP, one can say that, okay, increase your health budget, increase your education spending. And one of the former finance ministers from KP, he said that, and we know that there is no absorption capacity in the line department. So we need to strengthen that as well. Jeffrey Sachs advised about, cautioned about austerity measures under IMF program. And I think the $3 billion out of which $1.2 billion are already received. So for me, the $1.8 billion question is how to, where to park this cost of transition. So whatever is being said by different multilateral agencies, by different experts, I agree with them in totality. For macroeconomic stability, that's the path to go. But then as a representative of civil society and as a concerned citizen, I am also mindful of the fact that if I as a citizen, if I have to pay, and as a taxpayer citizen, if I have to pay the total cost of this transition, perhaps it would be too high a cost for me to pay. So we need to think of some sort of this cost of transition and how to balance it out among some of the sectors and some of the individuals who should perhaps progressively pay that cost of transition. And I think that's where the buck stops. Some call it elite capture, breaking elite capture. Other give it a different name. But collectively, we need to think of how to move ahead without losing our traction. That yes, we need all these reforms, and then not to put all the burden of this transition on masses, because that would be extremely difficult for them to bear. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention, and we can continue this informal discussion over dinner. My colleague can guide us where the dinner is being served.